Bookshop, and I also co-host our queer book club, Queering the Narrative. Thank you all so much for being here tonight, and a special hello to our virtual audience. I am so excited for this event, I can't even begin to tell you, but we have many more exciting queer events and romance events coming up this summer. June 22nd, we're hosting Andrea Bartz for her queer thriller, The Spare Room. June 29th, we are hosting our Limelight series, where I will be moderating a panel of 3 authors who write queer stories across different genres and age ranges to discuss how they queer the narrative. Tickets to the event are a sliding scale donation to Smile, a local organization right around the corner from us that works to empower LGBTQ youth. July 7th, Ava Wilder will be in to discuss her new book, Will They or Won't They? July 13th, Julie Soto will be here for her book, Forget Me Not. And July 15th, we'll have Tracy Livesey back in the store for The Duchess Effect, which you all have to come. It's going to be amazing. Tracy, we love you. Our calendar is always full of exciting events and book clubs, so be sure to check out our website for more information. Some small housekeeping details. Number 1, bathrooms upstairs, back past the registers. Number 2, we will have time for questions for night for both our in-person and virtual attendees. So even if you're watching via Zoom, you can participate. Please put those questions in the Q&A feature so that we will see them and can ask on your behalf. Number 3, if you need to purchase a copy of tonight's book, we have copies available. We'd be happy to help you out with that. All those copies are upstairs at the register and can be purchased prior to the signing line. This book meant so much to me. The entire time I was reading it, I was sending all of my friends just various screaming, crying, throwing up emojis and telling that all of them that, like, no, really, you desperately need to read this book. And Island Princess Starts a Scandal is the sapphic book of the summer, and I am so excited to celebrate it all with you here tonight. Our author of the evening is Adriana Herrera, who was born and raised in the Caribbean, but for the last 15 years has let her job and her spouse take her all over the world. She loves writing stories about people who look and sound like her, getting unapologetic happy endings. Her books have received starred reviews from PW and Booklist and have been featured on the Today Show and NPR, in Entertainment Weekly, the New York Times, and the Washington Post. Adriana is an outspoken advocate for diversity in romance was one of the co-creators of the Queer Romance POC Collective. Joining her in conversation is Lupita, better known as Lupita Reads, who is a passionate literary enthusiast amplifying and highlighting books through Instagram and TikTok. When she's not reading, you can catch her occasionally writing about books for Today.com, SheReads.com, and her Substack, where she highlights Latina authors and their books on a weekly basis. She lives in the greater Washington, D.C. area and enjoys visiting the local bookstores with her family on the weekend. Please welcome our authors of the evening.
Happy Pride, everyone. I feel like we got caught up back in there, like already getting into it. I feel so bad, but hi friends. I'm so excited to be here with you and to be able to do this with you. And I'm just like a huge fan of your words and so much goodness in this one. And so I just want to kick us off. This is book 2, right, of the series, Las Leonas. And I was really interested to learn more about what inspired Las Leonas. So three women. And could you talk to us about that?
I can. Can you hear me, or can I just talk? I'm really loud. Can you hear me? Oh, that's right. Sorry. Can you? This is good. Okay. So, I mean, the inspiration is twofold. I really wanted to write historical. I've been reading historical romance since I was too young to read it. And it's always been kind of like the subgenre of romance that I really loved. And I've always wanted to write it. And like a few years ago, I was doing research for a trip to Paris with my family. And whenever I am going to another country, I usually like Google Dominicans and that place, like just to see if Dominicans are just like doing something cool at that moment that I'm there. So I was going to Paris, so I Googled Dominicans Paris, and I randomly came upon this like article that was a few years old from like a Dominican newspaper saying that the Dominican Republic was going to like an expo in Paris and kind of like giving like a little snippet of the first time that the Dominican Republic had been at a World's Fair in Paris, and it had been in 1889, which I had no idea that happened, but we had, and it kind of like gave this like fun fact that we had borrowed some money from Belgium, and our president didn't pay it back. So when the king of Belgium was like touring the different pavilions, he snubbed ours because our president owed us money. So I was like, this is already so juicy that I need to research further. So I ended up doing a bunch of research about this particular World's Fair, which was the centennial of the revolution, and it's where they unveiled the Eiffel Tower. And if you have read the first book in the series, the Eiffel Tower is in it. And yeah, so it was like just like the first like true like global event in in history, like where like more than 50 countries were at the World's Fair. So there was like 32 million people that came to Paris that year, including 13 Latin countries. And it was the first time that Latin American countries were invited to a World's Fair as like independent nations and not colonies. And so like there's just a ton of information of the colonies, not colonies, the countries being there, of like the pavilions that we built. And there was like more than 7,000 Latin people that year in Paris having a great time. So I was like, why not have 3 Latin heiresses who are besties be in Paris doing their own thing there? So that was the seed of
Yeah.
the series.
And I love that. So is it safe to say that although it's a series, you don't need to read it in sequence? Like you could pick up like this book and then also pick up the next one. It doesn't need to be read in sequence because the characters just feel like they exist in this world and they're so vibrant.
Yeah, you definitely don't need to read them in order. You can read them separately.
Did you intend to like write it like that? Or was it just like you were so absorbed in this like world of these 3 besties?
I mean, you have to pay attention for that. Like if you've been reading romance long enough, you know that you want to write them where like you give people enough like, I wonder about that other couple they keep mentioning, but that they can read it as its own thing, like it's a single title. But yeah, like the idea is that they're connected, but not like interlocked. Like you can read them separately.
Yeah. And you mentioned before that you read like historical romance at a very young age, or romance in general.
Yes.
When did that like interest you, the specific genre of historical romance? Was there a special moment?
It was just what I started reading. I grew up in the Dominican Republic until I moved to the States when I was 23. But every summer I would come and visit family. We had family in New York City and we had family in San Diego. And my dad was much older than my mom. So my first cousins were like in their 30s and I was like 12.
Yeah.
So my cousins were reading grown-up stuff.
Yeah.
So I had one cousin in New York who had like categories and like a ton of Playgirl magazines. And so like I would like peruse. And then my cousin in the West Coast read a lot of historical, and she was a nurse and she worked the night shift. So she was like gone all night, and I just like would go to her room, and she had like a ton of like had them in like plastic bins under her bed, sorry. And I would literally just like borrow them, and she wouldn't notice because they were all under the bed. Like she didn't know like 4 Joanna Lindsay's were missing at a time. So that, and I just really loved, like, I mean, I always think of historical romance as like the Broadway of romance, because it's just like, there's just something about it that's just like a little shinier, like the dresses, the carriages, the like stoic, broody heroes, the heroines were like very dramatic. I just find it very dramatic. And it just like was something that I really was drawn to. And I would say my favorite author, not in romance, but just in general, is Edith Wharton. Like Age of Innocence is my favorite book. And I think it's also like that kind of evocative type of book of like a very, like it's very much about the setting and the time and the like etiquette and the like the little like manners and all that like social rules and how they impacted women. Because I think at the end of the day, what I love about romance in general is that romance really kind of unpacks women's lives and how women like make the best out of any situation and like claim their power and claim their future and like their love. So yeah.
And I feel like that just is weaved into your work so well and like so beautifully. So I love that you were able to like put that, because that's everything that I get from this. And I know like City Bookshop had done so like 2 reels, and they're like, this book is everything, and it like literally feels like this book is everything. So
Well, thank you. I had like many mental breakdowns writing, and my friend Tracy's back there, and she's like, it wasn't 2 or 3, it was like a half dozen.
So what were the mental breakdowns for?
I just felt it was my first full-length sapphic romance, and I just felt a lot of responsibility in terms of like rendering a story about 2 Latinas and like honoring like where they came from. I feel like a lot of that kind of character that I've gotten to read in historical, like we're like very rootless.
Yeah.
Like we're like kind of just there, and we're like part of a world that's not our world.
Yeah.
And so to me, it was very important to like give both Manuela and Cora like communities they could thrive in. Like I like the idea that a woman of color is going to come into a space and be able to thrive amongst people that are not like, who don't understand the context that's just coming from, didn't seem realistic to me. So I really had to like create a space where like there were other women who were Latinas, who were also there for their own reasons, and had to like kind of give the historical context for all of it. So I had to do a ton of research, which was actually super fun. Like I love doing the research, and I wanted it to be sexy. And I was really thoughtful about like the language that I use, even in their like in the sex scenes, because I didn't want it
And we're gonna get into them. So
I wanted it
have
to
to.
feel like like I don't know, like it's just different. It's just different how women see each other, desire, lust. It's very different when it's 2 women than what it's with a man and a woman, and it should be. And so yeah, so there was just like I feel like I was just managing a lot. I wanted to talk about the lesbian community in Paris and how vibrant it was, and the art scene in Paris and the exposition. Like I was like, why did I do this to myself? Why couldn't I write about a cupcake baker? You know what I mean? So that's why I felt like I was just like carrying a lot, and I wanted to like make it like I wanted the readers that I was writing this book for to read it and receive it like in a way that made them feel like this is what I've been wanting to read. Yeah.
And I'm gonna ask a Riley question, because I feel like lately I've been into trying to figure out more how people organize their writing, and
Okay.
I, like what was and you're like downer.
Organized.
Like how did you keep this all? It's just so well done, and I can't speak enough to that, because yeah, there is a lot of it, but none of it feels overpowering or overwhelming. It just feels like it's part of this world that you're in and that you're invited in to witness. So what were some tips that you would give to someone trying to like figure out how to world build and include all those things that they're so passionate about?
Well, I think the first one is you have to really do a lot of research. So I feel like the way that you are able in historical romance to just like blend in like a snippet of something, like usually, like I said, like if people only knew like that one line required me to read 3 books, because like you really have to be able to understand the world enough so that you can really like kind of like blend it in. And I mean, my first drafts are like a trash fire. Like they are.
I need to hear that though, because I mean, as someone who just even thinks about wanting to write, tell me about the trash fires, please.
My first drafts are pretty chaotic. They're not very clean. I always tell my editors that they're like a suggestion of where we're gonna get to in the end.
It's a promise, right?
Yes. Like the synopsis that I sell the book on is just like a whatever thing that you made me write for you. And then like the first draft is really like a suggestion. It's like kind of like the broad strokes of where we're gonna get to in the end. And I found that with historical romance, with contemporary, the process is different. I feel like it's a lot more straightforward for me. But with historical, especially because I don't really have any reference text, like I can't really go to a bookstore and find a romance novel that has like a cast that is just Latin women,
Right.
set in like in the 1880s in Paris. Like there's no other ones. Like there literally isn't any. And so if I were writing like, white characters in London in like 18 whatever, I could like literally twirl and like find 45. But I don't have reference text. So I really feel like I am kind of creating my own container of like, I really am like kind of like creating this text from scratch. And so it does require like a lot of like trial and error. So like I feel like for me in the process of writing these books, it seems to be I write a first draft and then I completely rewrite the book on the first pass of the revisions. And then I have a feel for the story and then I kind of like go with it. But it really does, like I do a lot of like picking and choosing, like what history I want to include, like what's important. Like to me, it was really important to talk about like Manuela and her art. This book really was about women. And so it was important for me to like write about gays and like what art made by women looks like as opposed to art made by men, which means I had to read a ton of books about like what art they had at the exposition, what art was made by women who were lesbians. And so, so it just like, I think it's just like, it requires a lot of, for me at least, like a lot of research, because I am putting history in those pages that like hasn't been there before.
That isn't there.
Yeah.
It reminds me of something that fiction writer Robert Jones Jr. said about his book called The Prophets.
Yeah.
And it's a book set on a plantation and it's two men in love. And so I think a lot about how, like as queer people, like our existence in history is hidden, right? So when you all are like writing into these stories and like creating these narratives and worlds for us, it's imagining us how we were without being hidden. And I feel like that's such a powerful thing.
Yeah, it is. I mean, and it was important for me to like, I love that book, by the way, The Prophets. And I think one thing that I like, all of us who are women of color, like are writing romance, like a lot of us are just trying to kind of like really like affirm the fact that like there can be happiness, there can be joy. Like we can imagine a life where there is like joy without like having to be broken first. And so like that's one thing, like without being bruised.
That's true.
Without the bruising, right? Like without getting and to me that was important. But also like if you and like the history that we've been served isn't the history that is, right? And so like once I started doing research about the Latin community in Paris, I found that it was quite vibrant. There were a lot of Latin people in Paris at that time, living, studying. Like when I first announced that I was writing these books, someone told me like it's fantasy, right? Because like there's like no record of like Latin people being in Paris before like the 1890s. And I was like, first of all, what the heck? And second, like this is like now like 400 years into like Columbus, like, you know, happening upon the Caribbean. No, you didn't imagine one single person from Latin America made it on one of those boats, like, carting gold back and forth for 300 years.
Listen, how?
So anyway, so like once I started like, first of all, like the lesbian community in Paris at that time was like it was incredibly vibrant, incredibly like public. It was very in the open. There was a lot of books. There were a lot of upset men. There were many angry men about these like lesbian clubs in Montmartre because they were making out on the streets and they did not like it. And so there were a lot of disgruntled men writing and documenting in great detail what these lesbians were getting up to in Paris.
I'm grateful they did that.
I am grateful too. Like there's a little part in the book. I think it's like right in the beginning, Cora, who is the Duchess, takes Manuela to like her friend's house, and they like kind of are joking with her that there's a secret sign for lesbians where they like flutter their tongues. That was like actually in a book. There was this. I was reading this book, and this man who actually like the epigraph of the book is from the same book. He literally was like, the lesbians are out there and they have a secret code. They flutter their tongues.
I love that so much.
So I was like, I have to put this in the book somehow. And so anyway, so there's just like, once you start reading up, like there's just so much information, not just about like how they were living their lives, but like just like with like the boldness that it was happening. I mean, it wasn't illegal. Like you could be a lesbian in Paris in 1889 and it was just fine.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I love to know that. Like
Yeah.
because honestly, I had no idea,
Yeah,
you know,
exactly,
like I had
exactly.
no idea. And I think I want to lean into talking about Manuela and Cora and also in terms of like inspirations for them. So was there historical figures that you lean into? I know you mentioned doing research. Did anyone pop up that we were just like, you know, this could be someone I could pull from for both characters?
I mean, like I would say tangentially, like, for the arts piece, because I knew Manuela, like part of how I envisioned this series when I began to think about it is that I wanted like thematically to address like different things that like Latin people were doing at this particular exposition. So the first book was like trade and commerce and specifically like spirits. So I wanted to talk about just like the economy of rum in the Caribbean, but also like the place of women in distilling as like historically and like the way that we contributed to like distilling. And for the second book, I wanted just to like kind of like delve a little bit into the arts and how like Latin women were present in the arts, but also like queer women were present in the arts. And that was also actually not that hard to find. You can just Google it, like literally lesbians and Exposición Universal, and you'll find a lot of things. So there was this place called the Académie Julian, like in the book, it's called Académie Pascal, but Académie Julian was the foremost academy of arts in Paris at the time. And they were famous because they trained women. And so like they accepted women students, women could be instructors as well. And they were like the best academy in training artists to take the entry exam to the Académie des Beaux-Arts, which was like the university schools, the university's art school, and had a very rigorous exam. So they were like they like trained John Singer Sargent to take his entry exam for. And also it was very gay. There were a lot of women who were queer, who were at the Académie Julian as students and who were coupled. So there were a lot of like, as it happens sometimes, like, you know, gay women to get together, some of them end up coupled off. So like there were,
Really? That happened?
it happened.
Okay.
So yeah, so there was just like, this was like a notorious place where there was just like really like art scene power couple. So there were like a few women, like Rose Bonheur was like a really famous naturalist at that time in Paris. She was a free woman. She wore trousers. She smoked. She was like a general badass. And like her partner was an American woman who was also an artist. And they were like a very big power couple, like in the art scene in Paris. And they were both like part of Académie Julian. So like, yeah, so like it was important. Like I was like, who could I place here? Like maybe Manuela could be in this scene because they also had a lot of international students. That was another part of the Académie Julian that was different from other art academies. They had a lot of Latin American students. They had a lot of African students. So they just like received people pretty much from any gender, any sexuality, any place in the world. Like if you were good enough to get in, then you could study there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, and I feel like I learned so much from your book too, in a sense of learned how to think of like history differently, right? And so while you were doing your research, other than, you know, learning about some of the things that you didn't know, is there anything that was like absolutely striking that you were like, whoa, this shifts everything?
I mean, there was just like a lot of little things. Like, for example, like that whole like part of like Cora, who is the other heroine, and I like to think of her of like a softer Sheryl Sandberg, who is like very like entrenched in the patriarchy and somehow thinks that her being at the table will somehow like dismantle centuries of sexism and misogyny. But like I was like, that's how I thought about it. I've learned to love her, but I did have to like, that's why she ended up having her life destroyed before the book was over. So, yeah, like with her, like I was kind of looking like, what can I, like she's a businesswoman, she's got things, so like she's gonna need some kind of incentive to kind of get roped into this like ridiculous agreement with Manuela. So I found all this drama around the Panama Canal, which I didn't know about. Like there was this like whole very scandalous history around the Panama Canal. And it again like made me think about all the things that I didn't know of like just like the many different ways. Because you think about like Columbus, he got to Latin America, and then like a lot of bad stuff happened for 200 years, and then like the Haitian Revolution happened, and then liberation began throughout the continent. And so like to me it was like interesting to just see like how much was happening in Latin America at that time, how global the world was at that time, and just the amount of women, like Latin American women, who were just like in politics, like in healthcare, in the arts. I just think it was just like, it changed everything in the sense that like I was thinking too small in the way that I thought about like how we were living our lives back then. Like I think like because we're just served, and I grew up in Latin America, right? Like I grew up in the DR reading Latin history, writing, and thinking about like Latin America is like a very vibrant thing. And still for me, you almost never think about women. You almost never think about the women who were like really like building like society and shaping it, like kind of like behind the scenes. So it just made me think like there's so much more that I want to write about in terms of like us and what we've been and what we've done.
And I mean, I think that's exactly what I feel when I read your book. And I'm glad that you said it, is that it made me feel like I have been thinking small.
Yes.
Like I hadn't had the chance to imagine us like this, like in these settings and with this history, so I think that that's what makes it so powerful. And what books have you read, or do you feel like really helped you lean into, I know you mentioned that you kind of feel like you're writing on your own sometimes, but were there any books that you felt, or people that you felt like kind of helped you feel like you could do this?
I mean, one book that I reread a lot of Gabriel Garcia Marquez when I was preparing to write this book, just because in my life as like, like a 12-year-old, the first time that I read a book that really felt like was my world was Love in Times of Cholera, because it's set in Cartagena, which is the Caribbean. And so like, I think it was the first time that I read a book. People were always sweating. Everything was hot, like chicken coops, like, like it was very like and I read him because of how he places you in a story, and like how he works the world around you, and like the smells of it, and like the feeling of it, like everybody's perspiring all the time in Gabriel Garcia Marquez's books. And so it's the Caribbean. And so to me, like it was the first time that I was very grounded in a book. Like I felt the setting was very familiar. And so I read a lot of him, but then I also read like there's sadly not a ton of like history like books, but there's a ton of like journals. Like one place that saved my life was the Dominican Studies Institute at the City College in New York City. There's a librarian there. His name is Jensen Ortiz, and he's my best friend. And I sent him like, I want to know, like, like people studying in Paris from the Dominican Republic between, in this chunk of time. And he would send me like articles, and there's a ton of research out there. Like for the first book, he sent me this article where there's like documented, like someone like kind of did the documentation that 70% of the people selling liquor in the Dominican Republic between like 1850 and 1890 were women.
Wow.
And so I was like, oh, okay, so that's interesting. So it is plausible that my heroine could have been very involved with like women like tradeswomen who were selling liquor and rum in the DR at that time. So like stuff like that is just like snippets, like some scholar sitting somewhere in an office writing journals that she thinks no one will read. And I've read them and they've been very helpful.
And they've gone into like making worlds, which I think is some really geeky, cool shit. Like I'm like geeked, you know, like
it was for this. I'm writing the third book. Well, struggling to write the third book, I should say. And it's all about reproductive justice. It's like my sad cry after Roe v. Wade is this book. So my rage book.
I love that.
And so
For you and for us.
and so she's Mexican Dominican, but most of her history, like her life, has been in Mexico. And I've been reading a lot about like just reproductive contraception and like abortion and women's health in Mexico in the 1800s. And there's like one book that's basically the book, and it's this one lady in Canada, in like a university in northern Canada, and I emailed her. I was like, would you talk to me? She was like, I've been waiting for this email for 10 years. Like, I would love to talk to you. And so like we did a Zoom, and she was just so excited that someone had read her book from cover to cover and had like highlighted, tabbed, and had like so many questions. So there's so many women scholars out there who have been doing so much work, like documenting all this amazing things that Latin women have done in history, and they're just waiting for someone to send them an email.
That's so motivating. Maybe I will try.
Yes, if you want her specifically, she would love to talk to you.
Well, I know that we're winding down on time. I don't know how that happened, but we will be taking audience questions. So if you all have some questions, please start thinking about them. I mean, we have to get into the tension. We're going to get into the tension.
Please.
That's something you do so well. Anytime I pick up your book, I am guaranteed to feel just like such good, like steamy, fun tension between characters. How do you approach writing such like tension that just it builds and builds and builds until the end of the book, and it still keeps going once you finish?
Well, I'm glad that's how it felt. It doesn't feel like that to me. I'm like, this is trash. None of it is working. I mean, I love writing. Like, that's my favorite day is sex scene day when I am writing a book. I love writing it. I love thinking about it. I love building up to it. And I think that's why partly because I love romance, and I've been reading romance my whole life, and I know exactly what are my favorite parts of a romance novel, and the things that I keep me going back again and again to romance is like that delicious feeling of like two people like just fighting the inevitable. And like with these two messy ladies,
they're so messy. I love it.
I mean, so this show, The Ultimatum, and of course
it was gonna come up.
I watched it in 2 sittings. It's my entire personality. And one of the things that I think like people were like, oh my gosh, they're just so messy. And I'm like, the Ultimatum came out. I am fully validated in every decision I made to make these women incredibly messy. Yeah. And now it's documented that there's a reality TV show that says that I was not too far off.
I mean, no, actually, it was you were tame compared to the Ultimatum.
That's what I said. Yeah, I mean, I think for them too, like especially because I did write a softer Sheryl Sandberg. I had to build really like, first of all, like very opposites, right? Like Manuela's basically like a chaos princess. She's just like, I'm just gonna do whatever feels like I should.
She's vibes. She's a Sagittarius.
She's vibes.
She's me. We are
chaos.
Me, yeah.
She's a fire sign. Like she's just like trying to squeeze the life, like the marrow out of like the little bit that she's got left of like the fun. And then there's Cora, who's got a plan. And the plan cannot be broken. And so there had to be like a lot of tension, but also like clear, like I wanted it to be where like Cora was like falling apart little by little by little by little until she ended up making a fool of herself. And so I think it had to have like that, like chemistry, like the chemistry, of course, like very intense, very like palpable, but also like there had to be like that push and pull, which is really like the most delicious part of reading a romance novel, when they don't want to fall, but they're just like going head first. And I also like, I thought a lot about with this book specifically, and I've written other sapphic stories before. I really wanted the language in the sex scenes and like the imagery in the sex scenes to feel different. I feel like I didn't want it to feel like a het scene. So like I really had to think about like desire is different when it's two women, and like how it feels. What do you think about like what you want? And so I think I took a lot of time trying to kind of craft those. And for the first time ever, usually when I'm writing a romance, the sex scenes are usually the first thing that I kind of like have. With this book, I didn't actually have any sex scenes in my first draft, and my editor, who had done like 10 books with, was like, "Where are the sex scenes?" And I was like, they're coming.
They literally are. Just give me a second. I mean, I can't say more. Read the book.
So yeah, so those, it took me longer just because, again, like I wanted to really be really intentional how I did this. So anyway, I hope it worked.
It worked. I mean, I'm telling you, it worked. And I think, I had a question for you. You just answered it because it leads right into it. It's just like, the language, the lesbian sex is so diverse in play is the best PC way I can say it in your book, And I think that a lot of when we think about, as a society, people think about lesbian sex, they have an idea of it, but that idea does like lacks like imagination, exploration. You're right, desire and like intimacy
and the intensity of it.
I
feel like, I mean, if you are someone that has never thought about lesbian sex, then you perhaps have not, or sex between two women. But like when you think about like women, like the intensity of like emotion, like the emotion that when you have no one putting the brakes on how much you can feel. Imagine how that is the first time that gets into a bed. You know what I mean? It's very intense. And I feel like to me, I wanted to reflect that. Like I did a lot of thinking even of like the art pieces and like thinking about like how women render women and like how women rend like an erotic scene. Like to me, it was like really important to just think about those things and like try to portray them. Like I have one scene where like one of like Manuela's art pieces is like Eurydice and Orpheus, and I've had beef with Orpheus since I was like 10 years old. Like, he's a stalker. So I was like, this is my opportunity to like read Orpheus to Phil. And so like, and like, yeah, Orpheus, like in the painting Manuela would have done of Orpheus, like Eurydice would have been covering her ears and super annoyed that he like took her out of Hades where she was having a great time.
Yeah, no, I was just like thinking about that, and I was just like, it was one of my favorite parts, honestly. And I love to hear that you were 10 and like this was like your moment. Like
it's been a 35-year like unrelenting despise.
The petty is strong and the grudge is strong. I'm here for that.
And his little heart.
So I'm looking at the time, and I know we have audience. Do we have audience questions? I have always a million questions to ask anyway. So let's take the virtual first.
Yeah. We have a question that says, I'm reading the American Dreamer series and I love them. I'm wondering what it has been like to write two male characters versus two females.
I would say that writing women took me longer, which is weird because you would think me being a woman it would, but I feel like I think women, like coming from like Latin America, like I always think like for some reason, like it's easier for people to envision two men falling in love. And I think it's the patriarchy and misogyny, because it makes sense that a man would want another man, but it doesn't make sense for a woman to have no use for a man. Like that is not normal, right? Like, and so like so like I think there is like almost, even for me as a woman who is attracted to other women, to like it like almost feels like growing up, like that was something like people could envision, like a relationship between two Latin men. And yet like between two like women who, as I write them, like two Dominican women, two Latin women, like it's something I have not seen a lot before. So I really kind of had to think about, how am I going to render this? And just because you're Latin doesn't mean you're the same. One's from Chile, which is like real far from the Caribbean. So like it's not the same history, it's not the same context, you know. Cora was like half indigenous, and like, so that's one thing. And then with the Dreamers, I feel like it was almost like, I feel like I could dive into it in like a way that was easier, perhaps because in my own prejudice, I perhaps think that men and their feelings maybe are like a little bit easier for me to pick apart than women. Like I feel like there's more complexity there. Like we are just more complicated beings.
Well, and probably also imagining like love without restrictions, like you said, with like, when you're in a Latin family or a Latino family, like they expect you to marry a man because he's the man of the house, right?
Like having no use for a man.
Right.
None.
Yeah. And it is weird.
Yes.
It is very weird.
Yes. I mean, to the misogynistic place that we are from, yes. It's like, I mean, well, like of course, like, you know, like I have, you know, I have cousins, like I have a couple cousins who are gay, and my mom was like, I could tell. And then, but you couldn't tell with my cousin that's married to a woman. It's like, yeah, I couldn't tell.
No, because it's denial.
Yeah,
they don't want to see it,
so it's somehow easier.
Go ahead.
Research that you couldn't find like a place for, but you just really thought was cool and maybe want to share. You can repeat the question so our virtual audience can hear it as well.
Yeah, so the question was, if there's a piece of research that I found that I couldn't fit into the book, but I could share now. And the question is yes. The answer is yes. There was many things. There's two that come to mind. One is that there's a woman that I mentioned in the book. Her name is Flora Tristan, and she was like a Peruvian French woman who wrote this like essay about unionizing and labor unions in 1843, and it like basically created like the labor movement in France. Like it like sparked it, and like it began like from that text. And she was Paul Gauguin's grandmother. And so I had like a whole, and I also have beef with Paul Gauguin because like of what he did in Polynesia. So I had like a whole exchange where they're like, and he's not even that good of an artist. Like he's gonna go appropriate in Polynesia now. And then I was like, this is too much. I'm gonna take it out. So that's an interesting fact, that she was Paul Gauguin's grandma. And I also had like kind of like the inspiration for Cora's dad was this man. His name was Porfirio, and he was actually a Bolivian Chilean. It's unclear if he was Chilean or actually Argentinian. And he was called the Rockefeller of the Andes. He was the richest man in the world while he was alive. And he had just a lot of mines in like between Bolivia, like the border of Bolivia and Chile. And he like was indigenous, and he was very interested in, you know, kind of like social capital. So he married off all of his daughters to European aristocrats. One of his daughters became a nun and had Coco Chanel make her nun habit. And so I couldn't slide any of that in, but he had like 6 daughters, and I talk about that in the book, that Cora's dad like married all his daughters to like aristocrats and kind of sent Cora off to marry an aristocrat in the UK. And it was loosely based on this man who was the Rockefeller of the Andes and was like very, very, very wealthy man in the last part of the 19th century into the 20th century.
Do you like keep all this information somewhere? Like,
yes.
and do you have like a burn list? It seems like you have a burn list.
I have
that they will go in the books, right? Eventually.
I have a lot of it is men, to be honest. Sorry to the men. And I keep a little list like Paul Gauguin. I'll get him next time.
I want to know, like you check it off, hopefully. Go back and check it off because that will make me feel satisfied for you.
Yeah.
Do we have any other questions from the audience? You already said the queer ultimatum. I'm kidding.
I read a lot of fanfic. I read a lot of fanfic in general. So there's just like a couple of fanfic authors that I just think write queer like sex scenes really well. I also like one of the things that I tried to do was read as like I watched what's the show on HBO? Gentleman Jack. So I watched that series, which was very helpful because like I like in the book, like there's the first like chapter that I kind of introduce Cora. She's kind of going into a meeting and she's like very concentrated on how she walks. And that like I watched one episode of Gentleman Jack where she's like walking through town, like dropping in on like people and like demanding her money. And so like I kind of like that was a super useful show for me because it just kind of gave me like choreography, like movement for her. And that was, and also like those two are also incredibly messy. And I love a messy lady. So those were two things. I read a lot of fic and I also like watched some like period like queer stories. So a lot of them are super sad, which is a bummer. But that one, despite the mess, has like a semi pretty good outcome. So yeah, so there's a lot more to read. I feel like to watch that I feel like has that like sexier vibe to it for historical. Yeah.
We have another virtual question.
Yeah.
Looking ahead, what can we expect from Apollo and Aurora? And what about Cora's stepson? Is there potential there?
For Aurora and Apollo, I am writing it now. Aurora is like the overall theme is reproductive justice. So, and Apollo just being also like a chaos agent. So they will be falling in love. It will be complicated. It will happen mostly in Paris. So that's the next book. And then with Cora's stepson, I keep thinking about a potential romance for him. And I actually think there's a character that's like just like has popped up in this third book that I feel could work, but I am not committing to anything until I finish this book because it's already like getting on my nerves and I've only been drafting it for like a month.
Oh, well, I'm excited about it. So do we have any more questions in the audience? I do have one more before we wrap. No? Okay. I feel like this would be so great on big screen. Like I really want it to be on the big screen. Have you thought about that? How do you feel about, books to film adaptations?
I mean, I just watched Queen Charlotte for
I was gonna ask about that.
And, I had many thoughts about it, but now I have only one. Shonda Rhimes, please call me. I mean, it would be great. Like I envision, like I think about this this series in particular, like I try to write in a way that I feel cinematic.
Yeah.
Like, setting is a big character in the stories. And so to me, I think it would be a great show.
Yeah.
But Hollywood.
Who would you have in mind as cast for Manuela and Cora?
Tessa Thompson from Manuela.
Yes, that would be so good.
And for Cora, there's this Chilean artist. Her name is Mon Lafarte, and she is like, she sings rancheras. She's like,
She gave like
so hot.
Chavela Vargas
She
vibes.
gives a
Yeah.
So her big inspiration is Chavela Vargas. She
Okay.
actually lives in the same town where Chavela Vargas
Really?
lived. Yeah, she actually was in New York in concert like maybe 5 months ago. I went to see her, and she is even more beautiful in person.
Oh
than
my
she
God, I
is
gotta
on-
check her out.
And her name's Mona Laferte. She has a great voice. She's also an actress, and she just has that like queer badass lady vibe. Also looks great in red lipstick. So she, I think, would be the perfect Cora.
I love that
Yes.
so much. I'm excited.
Her
I'm gonna
music
go
is
check.
great, by the way. So look her up.
I'm gonna look her up.
Yes.
So if no one else has any questions, this was such a pleasure. Thank you so much for talking to me, and
Thank you for
you guys for joining us today on a Saturday night. Happy Pride again.
Bye.
And thank you to East City Bookshop.
Thank you. That was wonderful. I was sitting in the back giggling my head off. We're now going to take a moment to set up our signing table. So if you all are willing and able to set your chairs to the side, we would appreciate that. All the copies of the books are upstairs. I'm going to bring out our little signing table and we can get the show on the road.